This week's conversation is with Barry Through. Barry is a really busy person, but he's also a person who has an incredible history. He's been involved with a lot of really important groups. He was involved with Keith McMillan in the development of the K-bow. He also had a long association with Recombinant Media Labs, Not Human's sort of incubator for interesting and forward-looking media artwork. So we get a chance to kind of talk to Barry about everything from how do you actually make something like the Media Lab, Recombinant Media Lab mobile, to what is it about cathedrals that are interesting from a media art standpoint. So I hope you enjoy this. It's longer than our typical podcast, but it's a pretty awesome one. So I hope you enjoy. All right, this week we're going to meet with Barry Through. Barry Through is a pretty amazing guy. He is one of the busiest people I know in the media arts, and so I'm really pleased that he's been able to take a little time out of his schedule. Hi, Barry. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Where are you right now?
Right now, I can't actually tell you where I am, unfortunately. I'm in a very big public venue, working on a ongoing project, very large media integration and screen project for a major franchise that
Unreal. Well,
you'll all know about later. But.
All right. Well, congratulations on the mystery gig. Let's kick this off by sort of having you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. What do you do? What are the many things you have your hands into?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in general, I deal with, design and execution of spatial media projects. I really like things that exist in space. I've never been somebody that's been particularly drawn to, electronic arts that exist exclusively in squares or screens. Projects that exist in reality that deal with the spatial characteristics of rooms and space through sound and video, and also interactive and performance works. So these kind of immersive and interactive things, both for installation settings and for performance. So that's the kind of space that I'm really have been working in and am interested in pushing further.
Right. Now, primarily, I think the thing that people would see if they went to your website, which is barrythrough.com, one of the things that's most shocking is the large-scale projection mapping that you're doing. That's for a company called Obscura Digital, right?
That's correct, yeah.
And what kind of stuff does Obscura focus on doing?
Generally stuff in that same space I just described. Obscura does a large variety of projects. We're really a creative technology studio that deals with, design, execution of these immersive and interactive events and installations. And so, one of the big buckets of work that we do is event work, and this can mean things like architectural projection mapping, which we've done a number of projects in. We do stage shows, design for stage shows, interactive installations, so things that exist for a longer period than just an event, which takes a whole different sort of planning and design around those things. And we're really pushing into projects that push more towards concepts of interactive architecture. So things that aren't just installations, in that they don't just get dropped into an existing space, but really the design of spaces and experiences around technology and how technology can transform space and affect people's emotional experiences within space and really engage them to whatever the use cases of the those environments might be. And so that's the general overview of what we're doing. We're about a 50-person company, and it's full of a whole bunch of people with varied backgrounds, a lot of musicians and artists and designers and fairly interesting people from a kind of unique San Francisco scene.
Right. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because this kind of work is it's the kind of work that even 10 years ago I don't think that anybody was really projecting out as being sort of like a future career option, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And so it means that your background wasn't one of studying architectural projection mapping or show design or anything like that. Why don't you give us a little history about where you're coming from that leads you to be able to pull this off?
Sure. And, I think that in one sense, the dots always connect in retrospect.
Right.
So, I can, it's one of the things where I'm going to describe how I got here, but whenever anybody asks me for advice, I kind of draw blanks because, I grew up in Southern Illinois, which is a pretty ignored area of the country, and it's also pretty culturally conservative, and so there's not much in terms of immediate arts or contemporary, even like scenes there. Although there are a couple of university towns that are, things come through and they're more progressive. But I did get I was very into computers. I had and that might be the irony of it. It might have been a sort of escapism from, a scene that for whatever reason wasn't particularly interesting to me.
Right.
So, I had computers very early on. I think we got an Apple II clone when I was pretty young, and I started programming on it just from stuff that, like, there was a manual that shipped with the Apple II clone that talked about AppleSoft Basic, and I remember starting to dig into that stuff pretty early, and then kind of kept with it and spent way too much time with video games and computers and all that stuff. Not doing anything. I wish I was one of those kids that came up with anything particularly of note during my teenage years, but no, I just kind of consumed media and hopefully gained some sort of feel for what interactive and narrative experiences were like from that stuff. In terms of so that's one thread, kind of like the computer thread, and I got in high school I worked in IT just as a job. I guess another way I got to where I am is from an aversion to doing food service, and so it's like anything to do to keep from having to
Work at McDonald's,
physically labor. I was kind of all over. And so IT and computers were a good way to do that, and they were a little bit more interesting, and for some reason were just kind of more in my desires than any other job I could think of getting. And so anyway, that's one kind of thread that developed those skill sets. The other is that I was always in music and band from early on. I played saxophone for all the way through college. I have 2 music degrees. And so this music thread is a big one for me. And, when I left high school, I was in marching band. I don't know if there are people that aren't familiar with the Midwestern United States, which I'm sure there are several listening to this, there's a big like drum and bugle corps are like a thing there. Right. Which is like people that march around on fields and halftimes on games, and like all the high school bands there have these marching band programs, and they all compete. Like it's a competitive sport there, right. Almost to the point that you could get out of taking PE credits in high school if you were in marching band in the summer. Like it's a pretty interesting phenomena. Anyway, this was a bit, I was always in this marching band stuff, and it got me into music. And when I left high school and was trying to figure out, going through the what on earth could I possibly do with myself now, I really fell into being interested in sound recording. I think because it was a way to integrate this musical experience with a lot of the technology things I was interested in anyway. And so the plan at the time was to get into recording engineering. And so to those ends, I was at the University of Illinois for a year, finding myself, and then went to Berklee College of Music in Boston.
Oh, sure.
And so, yeah, and so I was in the sound recording program eventually there. And then it was kind of an interesting twist of fate, I guess. The thing with the music production and engineering program at the Berklee College of Music is that there's very limited studios or control rooms are small. There's very limited space, so they only introduce a certain number of students every year. And there are a lot of people that don't make it, and what ends up happening is that if you don't get admitted to the program in your first year, basically your first 2 semesters or 3 semesters, if you want to have that major, you wind up tacking on semesters.
Okay.
But it turns out that it shares a few core, or it did at the time, I don't know what their procedure is now, but it used to share a few core music technology classes with another program called Synthesis, which is computer music. They called it music synthesis then because of when it was established, kind of. And, there are a lot of interesting people in there, Richard Boulanger, Tom Ray, Jeff, I can name all these guys that are there. And it had no admission requirements to the major. So the big hack for the school planning hack was to declare yourself music synthesis, start taking the core classes, and then you weren't behind when you finally got accepted.
Right.
The byproduct of that is I started getting into all this computer music type of world and interactive music and synthesis. That's when I started learning programming synthesis like C Sound. That was the first time I encountered Maxim SP and Richard Boulanger class. And so it was an interactive music thing, but I think even more than that for me, it opened up this whole idea of interactive sound and visuals and performance in like a bigger way.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because there are a lot of kind of common threads between some of the things you're talking about and other people's experience. First of all, this kind of Midwestern escape trajectory seems to be common. I certainly hold that for myself as well. But also, the entree from sort of a music background, but also this engagement with technology that leads you to sort of like swing the door open wider than you had initially expected. Now, some of that is because I think things like, what we now call media art, that was just, that wasn't even a sparkle in anyone's eye, even not that long ago. But it certainly wasn't an academic track or one that was treated seriously anyway. And a lot of times to get access to the technology that would do this stuff, you found yourself moving in the directions of either recording engineering or musicianship or whatever, because those provided entree into getting behind a mixing desk or a editing suite or some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they're who had the gear, right? That was
right, exactly.
This is the big problem that it seems like. I mean, I'm no expert on the development of academic institutions, but it seems like, the first problem was you had all these. Certainly, there's this in media arts. There's this concept of interdisciplinary, study, because you have to meld all these things together. The other side of that is that you have to have disciplines to be interdisciplinary between, right. I guess. And so you have these programs that have the gear, and they end up being host disciplines to a strange media arts program. So, I mean, certainly at Berklee as an example, they had a music synthesis program. By and far, it was geared at the time towards sound design for film and music soundtrack with
Sure.
computers, but it happened to have all of these weird little classes and outcroppings of interactive, you know, things that were more experimental. And I imagine that that's common for a lot of people's, I'm sure there are a lot of people that came out of like broadcast departments or whatever that ended up getting into, you know, and music, and music departments in general as well, because that for me, we haven't got into, we'll get into more of the spatial media stuff later, but for me, music is really a great metaphor for all this stuff, for one, because sound is kind of inherently spatial.
Right.
It's omnidirectional and it fills a space, and you have to deal with it that way, despite only having two ears. It turns out that, rooms and how you spatialize sound is important. And because sound is so mutable and like transparent, and things can morph into other things, and it's time based. So, all of those just very general concepts end up carrying on into visual arts and like experiential media with technology in general, the time-based, transmutable, spatial, those types of things are already inherent in music.
Right. Well, speaking of spatial media and specialized media, the first time I really interacted with you to any significant extent was when you were doing work with Recombinant Media Labs, which is at the time that I first met you, it was a building in San Francisco that had an immersive media display environment. And how did you get involved with that, and what did you do with RML?
Yeah, I mean, this is we could have a whole radio show about the very interesting history and cultural development that is Recombinant Media Labs and its artistic director, and Naut Humon is the guy's name.
Right.
And he's had a lot to do with, just to plug Naut for a second, because I think he's a guy that a lot of people aren't aware of, has had a lot to do with events in San Francisco, in the 70s, in terms of kind of weird audience abduction events, and just it's kind of like making situational environments and things like that,
Right.
as well as the really development of turntablism, experimental music and records. He's helped start the digital music's jury at Ars Electronica, and then past that did a number of things. So there's my kind of, and had some pretty seminal bands as well, rhythm and.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you bringing that up,
Yeah.
because I feel like it's not only RML, but in general, all the many things that Not Human had embraced turned out to be sort of the breeding ground for an amazing generation or several generations of people.
He's
wild work.
he's still around, so it's
Yeah.
many more generations.
Many
to
more
come.
to come, right?
Yeah, but I was I moved to San Francisco to get a master's degree at Mills College in electronic music and recording media. I basically picked the most different thing from the Berklee College of Music I could find, which was this school. Mills has an electronic music master's program, and their history is very much in the New York school. John Cage and Feldman and
Right.
all this type of more experimental stuff, which is much different from the Berklee. It has experimental elements, but you also are very much into like commercial music production. So
Sure.
you're learning. You take a class where they tell you how there's a design pattern at Berklee College of Music called commercial funk, and you learn how to write that, and that's it's useful, but it's what it is.
Yeah.
And so I was looking for something different for that, and ended up at Mills, and I was living in
Mills is certainly different than that.
it is very, very, I don't, let's just say it's a more permissive environment aesthetically.
Right.
So, I was living in Berkeley, California, and was walking around somewhere and saw a flyer for a show called RAM, it was a red flyer, and it was for this weird place, Recombinant Media Labs. And so, and the show was from a guy, Daniel Minche, who's in Portland, who's, a couple of noise artists, and this other amazing artist and gentleman who unfortunately just passed away, Zbigniew Karkowski. And it was strange, and the flyer was strange enough that I just, I had to go and see what this thing was about, and wandered into this extremely interesting environment, which was Recombinant Media Labs, and it was on Brannan Street in San Francisco, between 6th and 7th Streets, I think. What existed there was the first stages of this 16-channel immersive audio and video surround cinema presentation system. And the show I saw there the first time was just sound. Mm-hmm. But this was, and if you talk to anybody who's seen this show, basically, I can say that show was definitely transformative for me. And it was still the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life. It was just crushing. And it was the first time that I've experienced sound in a way that's really that visceral.
Right.
And where there's really nothing else in your head besides what's going on. It was brutally transcendent and visceral and punishing show. The fun story about that one is that during one of Zbignew's sets, the system crashed, like the sound cut off in the middle, and everybody was, what happened, what went on? We couldn't really tell if it was intentional or not. It was one of those hard, noise music cuts, and
right.
Okay, and everybody just kind of went on with it. But what it turned out later, upon inspection, happened was that the mouse had, due to the vibrations in the room, had bounced all the way across the dock on the bottom of the Mac and opened every program on there and crashed Pro Tools, which the sound was routed through Pro Tools for that thing. So when the program crashed, the sound just cut. And so that was the kind of environment it was. And I was like, and they had all these projectors and screens in there too that were being set up. And I basically at that point was like, no, I need to see what else is going on here. And through that met Naut. It's also a recording studio and the home of Asphodel Records in San Francisco. And so there was a lot of interesting experimental just record releases being done there. And I volunteered my time there basically and did, was working on shows there for 2 years. And we did all sorts of, kind of who's who of European and Japanese noise and experimental stuff. We had Yashiano Tone and Alvinoto and Pansonic and Biosphere, and so that's kind of where I got involved in. Is definitely my entrance more into video and visuals as a in space. This is really a surround cinema presentation system. The room had 360-degree video screens, and in a 3x2 configuration of 16:9 screens. And so you really are in a situation where you have this idea of spatial media synthesis. So sound and visuals linked together in space.
Right. Well, I experienced it for the first time. I went there for a show that had Sue Costabile did some work specific for the space, and then I can't remember who it was who did a noise piece with like really super jarring visuals. And a couple of things. First of all, the 360-degree both sound and visual. And I think it's important to realize that the 360-degree sound was really important too, because it meant that there was there was this way of, you would find yourself orienting your body in a way that, based on where you're sitting in the room and stuff, to sort of experience things in a very personal way. It was really interesting.
And it's a fairly small room. The room would fit 120 people, and it started to get uncomfortable after
Right,
that.
right. Well, I have personal space issues, so there's that too. But I just remember Sue did a piece specific for the space, and it was phenomenal because her sensibilities, but mapped into that space and with that sound system, was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just charmed by it.
Was that the Morton Subotnick piece? Maybe, I don't remember. Anyway,
I don't remember.
she did some work with Morton there too.
Right. I think
Silver
this
Apples.
was, yeah. I think this was not. This was something she had done just personally. But then this noise artist came and took advantage of this visceral experience. One of the things that you said really resonates with me is this idea that it expunges your ability to think of anything other than what you're feeling at that moment. And it was astounding. And so I just really found that environment to be a unique experience and an incredible one. Now, what kind of work did you do with RML? Were you working on the technical end or more with the show development?
I was working on the technical end and collaborating with a lot of artists to, realize different works in there. And it's an interesting thing. I think media arts has a very interesting problem right now in terms of who is an artist and who isn't, in terms of how people brand themselves and things like that. Because a lot of these works at this point require a kind of division of labor to even pull off.
Right.
And I can say, I've done a lot of technical collaborations with artists, and I can say that they invariably become creative collaborations. And, you're building a canvas for somebody else to work within. And so you're you're curating a set of possibilities that someone else can help explore. Unfortunately, there are a lot, I'm far from the only person who does this type of work. And so I think that there's a whole community of people that have worked on, every media art piece that you're aware of and love that don't get much credit to it.
Right.
And so it's an and this isn't said in like yeah, I did this, like a kind of position of whining about not winning enough credit, but it is, I think, an interesting problem in terms of, getting people engaged and like how just people's perception of how these massive works get pulled off, because there's not enough. There's too many tasks for any one person to be able to take care of all of them anymore. And so we're really getting to a place where like this lone artist warrior myth is kind of unraveling.
It's kind of falling apart.
It's falling apart, and you have pieces that are vast collaborations of both tools, technology, people, and aesthetics, and it's hard to how to package that in terms of people's personal stories. A little bit difficult.
Yeah, well, I think that there's another thing about that as well, which is it changes the way that a person's artistic resume is put together and sort of like validated as well.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was getting to.
Right.
Is like who do you perceive as, who gets put up there? Who do you perceive as artists? And it's not just an ego question. It's also one that defines someone's career possibilities and what kinds of things they get to work on. Because I guarantee I can name 20 people that the listeners have probably never heard of that have worked on things that they have heard of.
Oh, sure.
So
yeah. That's interesting. Well, one of the things, I asked you about what you were doing at RML, but I do that kind of already knowing, because one of the things that you did when I came to see this show is you actually took me into the control room and kind of gave me a quick tour of what technology was used for that show. And what I remember about that was that I was surprised that it was not sort of like a preset control room full of stuff that was just reused from show after show. It was very clear that for this show, custom work had been done to provide the best possible experience for that show.
Yeah,
I mean, was that a common story?
And in general, I think that's a common story, even more and more as from that time. I mean, that was 2006 probably, and there with that,
There
even
wasn't many
more.
preset options available.
Yeah, that's true. And and one of the progressive things that we've done is this system still exists. I mean, the quick story behind Recombinant Media Labs is that we ended up losing the Asphodel Records was the parent company, and due to just the general disruption of the music industry, it couldn't afford to maintain that space, and so we had to move out of there. And we're trying to figure out what to do with it, and ended up turning it into a touring festival system. And we've done a number of festivals playing, we probably have 40 pieces of surround audio-visual content by major artists that we can play and tour around. And so, we've done Transmedial and Mutech and, several more Cynet Art and ORF Music Protocol in Graz and a few more festivals. And anyway, what I was going to say is, that first system was really about, nobody really knew how to author content for that environment yet, and we wound up doing a lot of things as pre-rendered video. You were really just setting up a scene in After Effects or Final Cut and rendering out 10 screens in a big line, and then you wrap those around the room, right? But as we progressed, we started to do more things that were real-time rendered and interactive, and trying to figure out how to really make that space a completely mutable canvas for real-time performance, where you could have, performers in the space that could control spatial sound, could control video, interact with the audience, bring audience interaction into the installation. And so it really is this interesting gray area of installation, performance, sound, video, interactive control in this weird black box environment that is, by its founding nature, completely open to as much aesthetic experimentation as you can possibly fit into there. So in terms of like a nascent clean room for people to explore ideas, it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, but now I'm having trouble imagining this being a mobile unit, because again, I experienced it in a fixed space, and it was overwhelming. First of all, in its kind of complexity, and secondly, it seemed to really demand the environment that it was in. How can you lift that up and turn it mobile and still end up with that same experience?
I mean, I can say that certainly the building, the Brannan Street location was the flagship. That's until we can design out a new space. I mean, this space at Brannan Street had a lot of characteristics that were. It was designed out particularly for this purpose, and so there was a room within a room. It was sound isolated. A lot of the work was done for sound, particularly, and so sound isolation, acoustic treatment. The floor contained 32 subsonic, floor shaking transducers to augment the bass. That we had 8 L-acoustics, 18-inch subs, and 2 big subs at the end of the room, 16 channels of like PA speaker system. So they were all L-acoustic point source. So in terms of the sound setup, it's impossible to recreate the clarity and power of that room without building another location. In terms of the video, that's a little more doable. I mean, if you can hit 10 screens with 10 projectors, we've done things like increase resolution.
Sure.
Things to improve that, but that's a lot easier. And so basically what you have, I mean, I guess it's hard to explain without pictures, which if you go on my website or whatever, but it's basically a floating cube of video, a rectangular Prism or whatever, a video that kind of floats in the middle of the room. We have a platform that you walk up to go inside, where we put subs and the floor shakers under, and generally have, the original location was 16 channels of sound, but it was in 2 rings of 8 in 2 levels.
Okay.
So you got 3D is, it's important, 3D sound spatialization and panning.
Right.
In the mobile, we usually only have an 8-channel system of smaller speakers, which, does, for the spatial content, it does well. But, it's not there were different things you could do in the
room. Yeah.
In the room. So,
well, that's pretty. I'm really happy to hear that is that continues as a thing, because I remember being deeply saddened to hear that the RML was having to be shut down, and so the fact that it continues to live, I think, is really important, if for no other reason than as a showplace for these works that were created specifically for that environment.
Exactly. I mean, there's things, we have so many works, and it's funny. There's one reason I'm not worried, because I've had, been to festivals and talked to a number of people about it. That's like, there have been various, prognostications of the death of Recombinant Media Labs, and what I end up saying is, I have a hard drive in my backpack with 40 surround cinema pieces on it, and they're not going anywhere.
Right.
And somebody's going to want to see them.
Yep.
So, like, the content's there, and so we can recreate the system to show it. I will say that, the both Recombinant Media Labs and the kind of previous and sister space to it, called the Compound, which was out in an industrial warehouse in the Hunters Point area of San Francisco, and was there where Naut lived for 30 years until it also, the lease didn't get renewed from the state or city, and he had to move out of there, and it got leveled as well. That was also another place where a lot of after hours, underground, San Francisco surround and noise shows and recording, took place. Right. And was also, all these things kind of culturally connect. It was also the place where many of the people that founded, started, and work at Obscura Digital met. And so it's really, it's in a similar cultural vein, all this stuff. I was kind of in a second generation of people to come through the Recombinant Media Labs grinder and emerge. I can't say unscathed, but I'm still standing here.
Well, it's funny, because at the time it probably felt like a grinder, but now you look at it and it's like a hot box for growing incredible plants. Because again, the number of people who have had interaction with that have come out and done not all necessarily even related stuff, but just there's something about that environment that caused people to crack their heads open and say that there is a creative way to live your life.
It's extremely true. And I there are some stories like this where you look back and you say, actually, that was really great. I mean, in this, I can safely say for everyone that was involved, that every day we walked into there, you felt that. Yeah. It was like, this is we are going to be sorry when we don't get to be in this environment and space anymore. And we still say it. And even in terms of the city, the Bay Area and the city of San Francisco as a whole, with those 2 spaces gone, there's really been nothing to replace it. And it has been just a massive cultural deficit for a certain type of work in San Francisco, since those have gone away, and there hasn't been, nobody's really, Naut's one of these guys, and and the people around there were really the type of people that were willing to kind of, put their dick on the anvil and say, we're doing this thing because it needs to happen. Right. And we haven't quite found that type of investment in digital arts in San Francisco, which is a big, it's a big problem, and it's one of the areas that I'm kind of focused on a lot right now, is this problem of the digital arts economy in the Bay Area in particular.
Yeah, it's very much coming to the fore too. There's a lot of discussion now about, you know, San Francisco is sort of like the touchstone for this whole idea of the creative class, you know, moving into the place. But what we're seeing actually is sort of the decrepitude that can come with that as well.
Well, yeah, it's kind of what does it mean to be? I mean, this is another hour worth of discussion, but what does it mean to be creative? And the thing is, like, filling out your Facebook profile is not creativity. Like, that's not like user content generation in a template is not generally a creative outlet,
Right.
in a serious sense. And so, in San Francisco, you have this interesting problem, and it seems to come back to money. I think it's deeper than that, but that's a big part of it, the economic part of it, where you have, I run this quarterly meetup and kind of platform about these issues called ArtUp.
Right.
That happens. There's another one that's going to happen on Tuesday, and we around sonic and music technology. Who I do with a number of
people time shift this. So Tuesday is what date?
Oh, Tuesday is March 4th.
Okay.
2014. The year of our Lord, 2014 BCE, I guess, is that?
I don't know.
CE. So I run this with a fellow artist and collaborator, Matt Dryhurst, fellow longtime Max user Vlad Spears is involved as well. Sure. And so we got a good crew on this thing, and we generally run these events around different aspects of the arts and technology economy in San Francisco, and what our kind of goal or realization is there are really two sides of this coin, and one is that you have a technology sector that's not, for one reason or another, really supportive of the arts economy, cultural economy in San Francisco. You don't have Facebook and Google and Twitter investing in the cultural sector in the same way as you have Hewlett Packard.
Right.
Investing
and like if even AT&T. I mean, it's strange to.
Or even the old world, companies tended to do this, and I mean, just go to the opera sometime. I don't know if go to the opera. Just get up, go to the opera, and look in the back of the program and see who's in there. And I tell you who's not in there, which is any of these startup companies that have pulled all the money in the last 10 years. So you just don't engage in the cultural sector in the same way. So that's one how to engage them, how to make them realize that the type of art that uses new tools and new techniques is directly related and vital to the type of work that they're trying to do, and they need to be engaged with it. And the other side is you get a lot of tech workers that have come to San Francisco, and they got engaged with technology because it was something that really made them feel creative and made them feel like they could control things, and they had a voice, and they end up programming like SQL and like making CSS changes to like add notifications to or like all this junk that whatever, you're socially empowering. Like, I get it. That's not dismissive of the jobs, but it's not exactly a creative outlet, and I don't think a lot of these people know that there really are creative outlets that their technical skills can play into to create some really amazing cultural output. And so the ArtUp events are really just all about getting all these people in the same room, and hopefully like throw some beer in there and something will catalyze. I mean, that's the main thing. Is it's a cultural like divide. It's just from not having people in the same space and them even knowing that they're doing the same thing.
Well, I think that a lot of people look at money as sort of the evil in this because, as people become avaricious. But I think a lot of times, the money is there as much to just allow people to say, all I'm doing creatively is changing these CSS things, but that's going to give me the money that maybe someday I'll have the freedom to be able to do what I want. And I'm not sure they actually utilize that when the money shows up. but
I mean, it also takes a lot of investment and work just to figure out aesthetically what you want to do with yourself, and
that's
that
true.
takes years as well. And so uh, it's kind of something that you have to do every day, and you should be involved now, I guess is what I'm saying, instead of like some arbitrary time in the future if that's the kind of thing that interests you. But it's funny because there are a couple of different, there's a lot of digital art production that doesn't take as much investment. There's a whole net art community out there right now. There are people that make GIFs. It's exciting work. It's aesthetically interesting. That they're speaking and contributing culturally. But there's a whole, like, the type of stuff that I'm interested in for the performance and installation space, and a lot of other people are as well, which is making media pieces that exist in actual reality. It's like augmented reality, but it's like alternative environments and experiential spaces that takes just such vast infrastructure
And investment of both time and
time
money. Yeah.
and money that artists can't do it without some sort of unreasonable. It's not something that someone can take on their own financially.
Right.
And those types of things are a drop in the bucket for the types of revenues that a lot of the technology sectors putting in. And so I don't want to demonize these guys because the tech sector, because I don't think that's the case at all. But it is an interesting issue in that why don't we see the cultural contribution or interest? I think there are a lot of reasons, but it's a problem that we're trying to solve just through dialogue.
Well, that's cool. That's really interesting. Anyone in the Bay Area should definally check that out. That sounds fantastic.
And we have another event that's I'm not announcing yet, but it's going to happen late March 25th, year of our Lord 2014 CE. So that'll be another opportunity if you can't make it on Tuesday the 4th.
Okay, cool. Now, in terms of infrastructure, I mean, because we kind of swung the door a little bit for like the requirement for large scale infrastructure, that kind of leads us directly into the obscure digital stuff, which every image I see from it is art on the largest of scales. I mean, it's like the obscene scale. You work on the scale of the obscene.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of, doing work at scale and a couple of types of scales, at both physical scale and increasingly time scale. So and I guess spatial scale isn't the way to say it, but like network scale or something like that. So things that exist in longer periods of time, like larger campaigns where you can, and I switch over into corporate terms. That's another interesting conversation as well, like saying things like campaigns, right? But, like I said before, just making these kinds of works, and I think if you look at our catalog, you can see that it's not like we're just throwing advertisements up on the
Right.
up on the wall, but a lot of them do have corporate sponsors. A lot of them have civic sponsors. A lot of them have museum sponsors. But there's always a client type figure involved.
Right.
We are a commercial, we're a for-profit entity,
Right.
Although one very focused on wanting to do, we're artists wanting to do interesting cultural things. So larger type of campaign things and things that take like integration of like mobile devices to have personal connections along with campaign type of singular events like building projections and things of that nature, along with installation experiences that you can deal with different types of concepts and content across many different types of lenses. Conceptual lenses is like something that we're very much about.
I mean, in a way, there's a sense to which the experience with RML would prepare you for working with this. But this stuff is quite amazing and also sort of like has no precedent. Or does it? I mean, what do you think is the artistic precedent for doing this kind of work?
I mean, I think there's a lot of it. There's been artists that have done projections in space prior to Obscura. There's been art that's been in, just environments, situational environment. There's a whole lot of prior work in the sense of things that have fed into this type of stuff. There are a handful of other companies around the world that are doing some similar types of
Right.
things.
I guess I'm thinking more in the abstract, not necessarily, about obscure versus others, but the concept of this artistic structural or architectural mapping, because that's the stuff that I find really almost overwhelming. And it seems to me to be a very, and again, maybe I just missed the memo on where this came from, right? Because prior to seeing some of this work, anytime I saw something large scale, or almost every time, there are probably a few exceptions, but for the most part, what you saw was signage. The equivalent
Yeah.
of large scale signage. So if we could make the sign bigger, let's make it bigger. And all of a sudden, there was some shift where people said, "Hey, well, let's take some of the technology that allows us to do this signage stuff, and let's tip it on its head." I mean, it was either signage or it was promotional. I tend to think of a lot of like real-time concert video and stuff. It's just sort of like promotion of the artist on stage, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And maybe, I guess, there were some things that you two did early in their days when they were engaging with trying to do large-scale video artwork as part of their stage shows that was a precursor to this. What are some of the other things, though, that for you represent kind of the precursors to,
Precursors.
yeah, to this large-scale
Yeah.
and specifically architectural type work?
Certainly there are like stage shows. That's one thing, where you had there are some just rock and roll stage shows from the 80s, I'm sure that, you know, are technically comparable in terms of just orchestrated things that have to go together to make this stuff. And in terms of, use of spatial elements, I would say another thing is planetarium shows, dome shows.
Oh, sure, of course.
So that's a big, I would say if, and Obscura really started from doing domes. The two founders, Travis Threlkill, who's still a chief creative officer, and Chris Lejeune. Chris Lejeune, who's the CEO now, his family came from, owns Pacific Domes, which is a geodesic dome company.
Okay.
And so that was really the first type of project, was using projection to cover the inside of one of these geodesic domes.
Interesting.
So there's certainly all these types of historic dome shows or antecedents to that, and I think that I think the caves at Lascaux are a precursor to this type.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
really any sort of spatial experience where you really want to put people in an environment, and those sorts of caves were religious and immersive experiences.
Definitely,
A cathedral is
It's an immersive
a
experience,
perfect
right? Yeah.
immersive experience to this. You have, I'm blanking on the names of a lot of the pieces and artists, but certainly during the Baroque Renaissance period, you had a lot of trompe l'oeil effects in domes that were static painted type of work, but that were really meant in a religious sense to put you in an environment, in a lot of cathedrals as well, to put you in a immersive spatial environment that was, brought you into some sort of state of elation or religious experience or connection with the heavens. And so I think that type of cathedral, which is really meant to, draw you up, put you in an environment both sonically and visually in a religious or transcendent space, is the most direct sort of precursing work for what we're trying to do now, which is kind of this reboot of the Baroque. It's kind of a neo-Baroque idea of construction of ornamented space as a mechanism for some sort of transcendental concept, you know.
Sure. Now, one of the things you said during your intro is that you talked about how you are sort of like moving beyond the idea of just shooting projection onto existing space or providing a mediation of existing space into being involved with design where this kind of mediated environment is literally part of the design. And I think this speaks to sort of like this Baroque and almost church-driven processes where, because I think one of the things when you talk about that, one of the things I think is important is that there was a desire to harness art's ability to draw emotion out of people.
Exactly.
And they utilize that for the purpose of making a more ecstatic experience in the church.
Mm-hmm.
How does that translate, or what are the kinds of things that you can do in a secular environment where you aren't necessarily trying to get religious ecstatic behaviors, but having wonderment or awe still is a valuable or at least satisfying result?
Yeah, and I think maybe that's enough. Maybe beauty in and of itself is an end. I don't, it's funny how many similarities there are between, instead of a Medici or the Catholic Church, what we have is different sorts of sponsors of this work now. So it's Google instead of the Holy See, right?
Right, or it's Coca-Cola instead of the
it's Coca-Cola instead of the Medici. But we're in a very similar situation where you have some abstract godlike, entity who's trying to make some sort of aesthetic experience in a architectural, a media augmented architectural environment. And so I think we're in a very long tradition of this, this sort of stuff. I guess your question was like, what kinds of stuff can you do?
Yeah, well, what are
it's
sort of like the things that the things that it implies? And actually by laying the groundwork of talking about a cathedral as an option, if you think about a cathedral has very much a specific sonic footprint, and it has sort of like a visual. I mean, when you say the word cathedral, I think everyone flashes a vision in their head of what that looks like, what that sounds like, what the interaction with other people is like. And do you think that many of those things still hold as being the way that it works to bring this kind of artwork to an architectural place?
I think it certainly can. And I think one of the problems with talking about this stuff is by its very nature, it's meant to be sort of nonverbal in a lot of
Sure.
I'm sure you've had with Recombinant Media Labs, it's a good example, is trying to explain to somebody what a performance is like in there.
Right.
You always end up being lacking and get back to you just had to be there, man.
Right.
That's one of our, I can think as Andrew Benson is the coiner of a concept that we're going with called basically you had to be there.
Right.
Which is like, it's really just about the doing the thing, having the performance, not writing articles about it, like just make the work and keep, there's a little bit of that to something like this, because you really have to get in this state and environment to feel what it's like to be in that. I'm sure people have been in cathedrals. It can be similar. What kinds of, I think that you can do lots of things with these types of environments. You can help people be social. You can bring a sense of community to people. You can create a sense of societal maybe isn't the right word, but common shared focus on a certain concept, whether that be
community attention of some sort.
Yeah, just aesthetic or a cause like environmental, things like things of that nature, and so there's a focusing aspect to it. I think there's a lot of the same sorts of religious aspects of the experience, but not necessarily with those overtones, like just a sense of like the awe feeling comes with, humility and questioning of your place in the world and all those sorts of feely things that we like to feel.
Right.
And it's, with the interactive aspect of it, there's really, for any sort of concept or thing that you might want to be a proponent of, there's usually a way to help people to understand and engage with it through some sort of either immersive or, we've talked more about that than the interactive, but this type of interactive thing where you're actually having someone be in a dialogue with some sort of technological experience in a way where they have effect over it and it becomes reactive or adaptive to their presence, which is a whole other vector of this type of stuff.
There's another hour for us to talk about, and the fact of the matter is, I mean, that's something that there's a bunch of things I was hoping to get to, and already we have kind of shot our time. But one of the things that I know is sort of a thing for you is the design of interaction. And, I wanted to talk a little bit about your work on the Cabo because that is a very specific kind of interaction. And how you do stuff where it's sort of like not the clap your hands, flash a light kind of interaction.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, listen, we can totally go over that briefly. I think we probably should have put it earlier in the conversation, right, since it was a big developmental thing for me. But the Cabo was let me go back a little. In sometime around 2004, I responded to a Craigslist ad and met up with this guy Keith McMillan, who's a brilliant instrument designer who's out of Berkeley, California, and the long tradition of amazing electronic music instrument designers in Berkeley, California, like Don Buchla and Dave Smith and Roger Lynn and Tom Oberheim. And he was looking for a studio assistant, but it was kind of a bad way to phrase that job because, what he was doing and had been for a while is this sort of interactive music ensemble he called Triometric, which I think you saw that show at Recombinant at AES. Yep. You did see that show. Yep. So briefly the concept behind this group was that it was violin, bass, and guitar, electric bass and guitar trio, whose the instruments were augmented with sensors. And so in addition to the sound that came from the other instruments, which is normally how an ensemble plays, you have this data that can be passed around. And so what it means is you can have this sort of richer interaction than a standard ensemble because things can happen like, there's all this analysis involved and they're all networked through a central computer system. And so things can happen like the position on the violin player's bow can affect the filter sweep on the bass. And so you have players that can actually affect each other's sound and composition. We had a whole notation system to this thing where notes can be moved around and transposed based on real-time interactions from the other players and all the electronic scoring system to save these pieces. And this is another whole hour of discussion, but basically our goal in this organization is called the Beam Foundation and still exists, is to try and spur a method of electronic composition or a new aesthetic that is based out of these kind of tools and techniques of the 21st century, because there's a whole story of, the history of music technology is a history of the history of music and composition is a history of technological innovation. People don't really think about it that way a lot, but like the introduction of the piano in and of itself was a huge sea change for what was possible musically. The viola da gamba. There's all these instruments. Saxophone more recently. There's a synthesizers most recently probably. But there's the computer music. There's this whole world of change in music that's driven by technology change. And we were creating this system to conceptual system to link traditional musical instruments of the orchestra with new technologies to try and leverage the virtuosity of traditional orchestral players with some of the interactive things that were possible. And so the short story is we ran out of money in that company and started to do spin-off products to support it. The first of which was the Cabo, which was there's some prior work, particularly at MIT and some other places, and from a violinist named John Rose. There's a lot of stuff that's gone on about electronic bows, the violin and electronic bows in particular. But this was the first commercially available, sensor bow for string instruments that was stage ready. So you can buy it, pick it off the shelf. It's Bluetooth enabled, so it connects to a standard computer and sends over data from, I think it's something like 9 sensors that are on board. So you can get, there's an accelerometer for gestures, there's and tracking.
There's tilt and pressure.
Tilt,
amazing.
hair pressure, grip pressure, all this stuff. That gets sent to the computer, and you can do things like, if you want the compression or distortion to go up when you go down the bow, or if you want to control echoes by shaking the violin bow, and there was a whole suite of software, and this was written in Max MSP along with it, that allowed you to take all these interactions and do different sonic and visual things with it. And so in terms of like interactive data and how to use it compositionally and artistically, along with what's a very demanding group of people, which is string instrument players,
right.
Classically trained and string instrument players, was a big sort of learning experience for me in a lot of ways, just in terms of how to even deal with these types of concepts from a software development and artistic sense and all this stuff. And the company turned into Keith McMillan Instruments. It still exists. They've recently do products like the QNEO is their newest sort of release, which is a multi-dimensional drum pad type controller. It's all things that are still in line with these concepts that we were working with back then. So it's pretty interesting stuff to look into if you're interested in alternative electronic music controllers.
Right. Well, in fact, I think what we're going to do is we're going to book another interview sometime in the future for talking about specifically interaction design, because I think that that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily have their brains wrapped around yet. Mm-hmm. But also,
and it's a big need right now. It's like interaction designers that's big money, man. And I didn't go through the Post-it note and boxes and lines school. Well, I guess boxes and lines a little bit, but that type of conceptual school of interaction design. But I have been designing interactions for a number of years. I can say that like it's a skill that's very much in demand, and so it's something that needs further elucidation.
Right, and so often when people talk about interaction design, it's like, how do I interact with my website? Mm-hmm. But the things that you do are interactions in so many simultaneous dimensions, and I would really like to dive into that. So we're going to book some time in the future to talk about that.
We'll do that sometime. It'd be fantastic.
Yeah, we've completely, in fact, shot the time allocated for this. So I apologize for squeezing you out of your day. But before we go, I would like to ask you about one thing. Kind of prominent on your website is a discussion about a Bassel Khartabil. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. Khartabil, yeah.
Khartabil?
That's right, yeah.
Who you mentioned has been imprisoned since 2012. Could you give us a little bit of background about that and tell us? I noticed on your site it says that there's a FreeBassel Day on March 15th, 2014.
There is. It's coming up, for sure.
Can you give us a little front end on what we're talking about?
Sure. Bassel, I met through a lot of work. One of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is open source software and open culture and these types of things. And I am not as involved as I used to be, but I still, try and support those projects and keep up to date with what's going on in that world as I can. And I met Bassel through some mutual friends, a guy John Phillips and some more people from Creative Commons. He was very involved with Creative Commons, and he lived in Damascus. And I met him in China at one point, and then went out to Doha to work on an open source software conference out there with a bunch of friends, and Bassel was out there, and then we went to Damascus and hung out. Anyway, Bassel is interesting, and he opened up a hacker space or educational space in Damascus, and it was really a focal point for people in that area to learn about technology, in all sorts of respects, in a city that doesn't have much of that stuff. So there were workshops there, educational stuff, all this different type of interesting programs that were running, in Damascus, and he's also done a lot of interesting projects, did some web development frameworks, and he has an interesting project where he recreated a 3D model of the city of Palmyra. It's kind of a historical project. It's a lot of interesting stuff. Anyway, he was basically through the dangers of creative technology as perceived by the Syrian government. Bassel was detained I don't remember when it was now. It must be about 2 years ago. And has been imprisoned in Damascus since that period. We're in contact with him. He's there, and could be doing worse, but we're trying very hard through as many avenues as possible to get his message about the things that he believed in out, and to try and push in a public media sense and in other ways for his release, as basically a non-combatant that's being detained just for his work to really try and bring creative technology and technology in general to as many people as possible educationally. So we're all crossing our fingers on that, and look up his story if you're around. It's Bassel Khartabil, and it's a pretty interesting tale in and of itself.
Sure, I'll put a link up on the podcast website. But what can people do? What can our listeners do to help?
I would say the easiest and one of the most effective things that people can do is bring attention to the story. I can say with certainty already that the public attention on him and his causes has had extremely positive impact for him in his conditions and livelihood. So as much as that we can continue to gain attention and hopefully bring action on that. That's the easiest thing to do. Share the story.
Sure.
And that actually does something in this case. So it's good.
It's fantastic. Well, Barry, thank you so much for your time. Fascinating stuff. We'll get together again soon to talk a little bit more about some of the many things that we only glossed over, but it was a fantastic discussion. And
if I could have a discussion like this every Friday, then I'd think my life would be a lot more fruitful. So.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it's one of the things that I really enjoy is the opportunity to talk to creative people. It helps me feel motivated to stay creative as well.
Yeah, so right. I officially forgive you for having Josh Goldberg on. And
well, now Josh Goldberg's not going to forgive me for saying that you and I are going to talk again. So there you go.
Yeah, now everybody's going to need a second round.
That's
now
right,
see what
exactly. Well, thanks again.
Thanks much.
Have a great day.
Yep, you too.
Bye. And there you go. Clocking it in at almost an hour 15. That's by far our longest podcast, and I still feel like we have hours more of material to cover. We'll get in touch with Barry again to kind of dig into some of these issues more in the future. Thanks again to everyone for sharing, for being willing to talk to others about this podcast. Again, our listenership remains strong. And if you have ideas for the podcast, please feel to reach out. I'm DDG at cycling74.com is probably the best way to get hold of me. Otherwise, thanks again, and I'll talk to you next week.